I'm following up my hardtail versus full suspension video that I posted about a week before this one with a video that's going to be a little bit more conversational. And I'll talk about some of the same things that I mentioned in that first video, but it's going to be a little bit more focused, and we'll probably expand a little bit on some of these pros and cons. Now, I know some of my videos get kind of lengthy, but I think 15 or 20 minutes is a decent amount of time to invest in exploring a topic if you're spending $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 on a bike. You want to make sure you're making the right decision. So this video is not going to be a 2-minute overview of this topic. So let's go ahead and get into it. When I first got my first real mountain bike, my first real mountain bike was totally rigid. It was a Specialized rock hopper. Then I got out of mountain biking for a while. When I got back into it, I remember shopping for either a hardtail or full suspension. And this is when full suspension was really just coming out. And there was a Trek Y bike. I don't know if you remember those. It looked like a V guitar. And I decided not to get that one. And I'm so glad that I didn't. I ended up with a Specialized stump jumper that I ended up racing, and it turned out to be a much better choice for racing. But the reason I'm glad I didn't get that first one is because, or the Trek full suspension, is because it really wasn't a high quality full suspension bike like you have today. My riding skills developed a lot better on that Specialized stump jumper hardtail. It was kind of ugly. It was an orange bike with a red fork. Go figure. But let's talk about the advantages of a hardtail. And again, I'm going to repeat some of the stuff that I said in the other video, but I think it's worth distilling it down to these pros and cons. So first of all, they're a lower price point. Typically, you're going to spend about $800 to $1,000 less for a bike of equal components, equal wheel set for a hardtail than a full suspension. So it's a lower price point. And like I said before in the other video, it's the best choice, I think, for someone who's just getting into mountain biking. And that is because you're not spending as much, you're not making as much of a financial commitment when purchasing the bike, but also it's going to develop your riding skills. And the way it develops your riding skills is it forces you to maneuver the bike more. It forces you to use your body to absorb some of the bumps, to get over logs, to get over even smaller stuff, even smaller roots. You got to get out of the saddle more. So it just teaches you to be a better rider when you start off on a hardtail. So really keep that in mind. Also, hardtails are less complicated. They're less maintenance. You don't have to do pivot maintenance or rear suspension maintenance. Now, air sleeve maintenance on a shock is very simple. It's about a 20-minute process, but it's still something you have to do. And if you ride in muddy conditions, then you're going to get more stuff in your pivots, and you're going to have to maintain those more often. You really don't have to do pivot maintenance that much. I've had bikes for 2 years that I've never done pivot maintenance, but I don't ride in really muddy conditions very often. When our trails get wet, they're horrible. There's a lot of silicone, and the sand gets in your drivetrain. It destroys your brake pads. So it's just really worth just not riding that day or riding on dirt roads if the trails are wet. So I don't end up riding in a lot of wet conditions. But if you do, keep in mind that on a full suspension bike, you're probably going to have to replace your pivots about every couple years. And it kind of just depends. All right, so also hardtail bikes are lighter weight compared to an equally equipped full suspension bike, especially an equally priced full suspension bike. So a $1,500 hardtail is going to be quite a bit lighter than a $1,500 full suspension bike. Hardtails have instant power transfer. So when you pedal a hardtail, There is not going to be a suspension or a shock, I should say, to absorb that power. And this is especially true when out of the saddle. Full suspension bikes, unless you lock them out, are going to bob. In other words, bounce up and down when you're out of the saddle, whether you're sprinting or going up a hill. And that absorbs some of your power. On a hardtail, as soon as you stand up and start cranking, the power goes right to the pedals. Now you can learn on a full suspension bike to keep your weight more even, so you're not bouncing up and down as much. Even out of the saddle, even sprinting, you can learn to sprint without, again, bouncing up and down, keeping your weight more level as you sprint or climb a hill. And that's how you can minimize that pedal bob on a full suspension bike. But it's still, a hardtail typically is going to out sprint a full suspension bike. Now my full suspension race bike has a lockout, so I can just hit a thumb lever and the suspension's locked out. So it's just as efficient as a hardtail, and that's also a very light bike, but it's also a pretty expensive bike. So as far as the choice for, well, let's talk about a couple more things as far as the handling of the bike. So typically a hardtail mountain bike is going to have a tighter wheelbase and shorter chain stays, and that allows for a bike that's more agile. When you're on tight twisty trails, the bike just gets around the corners better because of the shorter wheelbase. Now that shorter wheelbase can have some disadvantages, and that is the bike can feel a little bit less stable when you're going down a really fast and particularly rough descent. But for the most part, I prefer a bike with chain stays as short as possible. And today bikes are coming with longer top tubes and a little bit lower center of gravity with short chain stays, and it's producing bikes that handle so well. So you can minimize that instability with what's called a longer front center. And that is the distance between the front axle to the bottom bracket. So as that gets longer, you can kind of increase the stability of the bike, keeping the rear of the bike shorter. So the distance between the bottom bracket and the rear axle, if it's shorter, it makes for a bike that's just more playful and more fun to get around corners. And the trails that I ride are typically very tight and windy, so I like those bikes to have chain stays as short as possible. On a full suspension bike, you can only get chain stays so short. Now there's some pretty awesome engineering that's coming out. Remember when Specialized released their Enduro 29er, they engineered that thing to be really amazingly have amazingly short chain stays. So they are getting shorter on full suspension bikes with engineering and wider axles and everything. As far as racing, so hardtails are going to be really good for short track racing because you're out of the saddle sprinting out of corners a lot on short track. Cross-country racing, it's really going to depend on the type of course. So if the course has a lot of climbing, hardtails are probably going to be the best choice. Cross-country races are around an hour and a half, 2 hours in length. So the fatigue factor isn't as high as longer endurance racing. That's why hardtails are still a pretty good choice. And we'll talk about the advantages of full suspension here in a minute. But one of the disadvantages to a hardtail is the longer you ride, the more fatigued you can get in relation to a full suspension bike. I had mentioned racing in the mountains. So oddly enough, I feel like hardtails are a little bit better in terrain where you're out of the saddle climbing a lot, or maybe in the saddle climbing, but you're out of the saddle descending. On my local terrain, where you don't have climbs as long and sustained, I'm in my saddle more, and I like riding a full suspension better than a hardtail. When I go to the mountains, I'm out of the saddle on a long descent. I mean, I'm out of the saddle almost the whole descent. And when I'm climbing, when you're climbing, you're not going as fast, so the bumps aren't hitting the bike as hard, so you don't need as much suspension. So, just keep that in mind for a hardtail. Now let's talk about full suspension. let's talk about the advantages of full suspension. Now, obviously, they're more comfortable. The bumps don't transfer to you as the rider. On a hardtail, you have to get out of the saddle a lot to absorb those bumps. And it's your legs, it's your back, it's your arms that are absorbing a lot of the bumps. And so full suspension bikes are just more comfortable. They are also faster for descending. Whereas a hardtail is going to be typically faster on a climb because of the instant power transfer, and typically they're a little bit lighter weight. A full suspension bike is faster on a descent. And that's because you can just ride with more control. You can hit terrain, because remember, the faster that you go, the harder those hits are going to come. So if you hit a 3-inch size rock or root at 5 miles an hour, it's not a big deal. If you hit it at 25 miles an hour, it's a big deal. And you've really got to maneuver the bike on a hardtail, get out of the saddle, maybe even bunny hop it a little bit. On a full suspension bike, a 3-inch hit, especially a longer travel trail bike, you can pretty much just cruise right over it. So that's why they're faster descending. When you're going through rock gardens, when you're going over consecutive routes on a full suspension bike, you just ride with more control. And you have less body fatigue. So like I said, with a hardtail, you're using your body to absorb the bumps. The full suspension bike is doing that for you. Now, I do want to mention the reason that you can get away with having a bike with no rear suspension but only front suspension and still be pretty comfortable is because when you're riding a bike, the impact on the front tire is you're pushing the tire into that impact, whereas the rear of the bike is getting drug over that impact, and it's not near as harsh, not near as severe. Now, I just don't recommend a fully rigid bike. In other words, a bike with no suspension at all. That's you're going to be kind of limited on your terrain, and they're just not comfortable. So today I did a gravel ride on a cyclocross bike with no suspension. And 40C tires, so small tires compared to a mountain bike. But it was fine because the type of terrain that I rode on I didn't need suspension. And so that's another thing you got to keep in mind when looking for a bike is the type of terrain that you ride on. If you do a lot of dirt road, smoother trails, you don't need the extra weight and complexity and expense of a full suspension bike. I wouldn't want to ride my trail bike on a 2.5-hour dirt road ride. And I put in some pretty long miles on my cross bike. In another month or so, I'll be putting 4 or 5 hour rides in to get my base miles in on my cyclocross bike. There's some terrain I don't want to ride 5 minutes on my cyclocross bike. I don't want to do a rough mountain bike trail on my cyclocross bike. It's just not fun. So you really got to look at the type of terrain that you typically ride when you're making this decision. So a full suspension bike is just going to be faster over rough terrain. Now that rough terrain doesn't necessarily have to be mountainous. It doesn't have to be long descents. I found that when trails are fairly rooty, even though they may be fairly flat, I'm still actually faster on a full suspension bike. Back issues. This is an interesting one because unfortunately most of us are going to experience some kind of back issue at some point in our life. It sucks. Having back pain is not fun, but it's just a fact of life, and strengthening your core can really minimize that, by the way. Sometimes you don't start strengthening that area of your back until you do hurt it. But a full suspension bike is going to be easier on your back. If you've had back surgery, you're probably not going to want to ride a hardtail. Now, if you've never had back pain, I feel like riding a hardtail can actually strengthen your core more than a full suspension bike. You're using your core to get your weight off the saddle. And so you can actually have a stronger back riding a hardtail, but you got to understand, if you keep your butt on the saddle and you're taking those impacts over a very long period of time, it could cause more back pain later on. So that's just something to consider. I know people have put comments on some of my other videos about that issue, so I just wanted to bring it up. You know, when I ride a hardtail over rough terrain, a lot of times I'll get like back pain in my upper back, just the way I'm using my body to ride the hardtail. So again, I just wanted to mention that in this video. As far as racing full suspension bikes, if you're doing endurance racing, if you're doing marathon cross-country racing, I think one of the best choices is a full suspension 29er, about 100 millimeters of travel front and rear. That to me just makes the best bike for endurance mountain bike racing. Now endurance cross-country racing is different from enduro racing. And I won't really get into enduro racing, but if you're doing enduro racing, I've never really seen somebody do very well on a hardtail. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but I think a longer travel full suspension bike, 140 to 160 millimeters of travel front and rear, is going to be the best option. Now, I won't really get into plus size tires, but you know, some studies are coming out that show that bigger tires like 2.6, 2.8, 3.0 tires can even be a good choice for enduro racing. I wouldn't recommend it for cross country, but for enduro racing, the larger tires can be faster depending on the course. So there's my conversational video on hardtail and full suspension bikes. Again, I know I repeated some of the stuff that I put in the other video, but I wanted to just kind of have more of a discourse on the subject. If you haven't watched that one, I did some lap time comparisons in that particular video. So if you're interested in that, go back and watch it. I won't give away the results. You'll have to see it in the video. So any questions or comments on this subject, leave them below. Thanks for watching.